I want to begin with the quote, which is the theme for the conference. It's the quote on the tote bag. It's the quote on the water bottle. And my goal in this session is to offer a few ideas about how to take that idea from the swag to the center of our economic lives. But when I look around the world today, I have to admit to feeling negative about the prospects around us. I feel overwhelmed at times by the scale of the problems facing our society. And I've had the privilege and the opportunity to work with some of the companies at the pinnacle of that system, some of the companies that people look to for the solutions. They look to with hope. I've worked in my career to use markets to solve social and economic problems, to leverage capitalism for social good at the intersection of business and social justice. But I am more and more persuaded that capitalism itself is a significant cause of the problems that we face, and not because capitalism isn't working well, but because capitalism is working all too well. Now, this is not a great way to start these few days. We're in California. This has got to be upbeat. The next few days are going to be upbeat. They're going to be inspiring. And I don't want to bum everyone out with a whole bunch of statistics about capitalism's failings. I have them. We all have them. We are surrounded by them. And I am confident that you wouldn't be here if you weren't already aware of those. But I think it would be disingenuous not to begin this talk without us asking why, at a time when our world is richer than at any time in its history, why are the vast majority of the world's peoples sinking ever deeper into hunger and wretchedness? To ask how, when those who presume moral stewardship and political leadership for our world have at their disposal wealth beyond measure, why are income and opportunity spread so unevenly between nations, within nations, and why do they persistently exclude women and people of color from the center of our lives? And to ask when, while our planet is plunging into a seemingly irreversible climate emergency, when will the culture of unbridled consumption and unconscionable wealth accumulation be addressed? What is most alarming is that when we turn to our planet's best thinkers to address these questions, they almost invariably suggest more capitalism or different flavors of capitalism. We need new thinking. Einstein spoke to this, to where these new ideas come from. He said, if we want to improve the world, we cannot do it with scientific knowledge, but with ideals. We must begin with the heart of man, with his conscience. And the values of conscience can only be manifested by selfless service to mankind. A distinguished environmentalist said on the BBC, the top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation, and we scientists don't know how to do that. So I want to talk today about how we find the moral courage to change behavior. Now, it's tempting to talk about what others should do, what politicians should do, what countries should do, how our system should be different. If I could ban should from this stage in the next few days, I would. I'm tired of should. I want to talk about 4 things that we can all do to build spiritual capital and to help us lead a coherent life where our economic decisions are in accordance with our ideals. And I want to acknowledge here a huge debt of gratitude to a talk I heard Brian Stevenson from the Equal Justice Initiative, many of you know, give about 4 things to do about, he was speaking in the context of criminal justice. The first thing Brian said that we could do is to get proximate. To get closer to those whose problems that we seek to address, those who suffer in our midst. We are simply too distant. Here in Asilomar, we are too distant. in most of our workplaces, in most of our boardrooms, we are too far away from the realities of the world. And the more distant we are, the easier it is to tune out the human suffering and rationalize the decisions we make. When you get close, you simply can't do that. I was working with the CEO of a major global mining company, and they were in the process of building a massive copper mine, a copper mine that was going to be more valuable than a third of the GDP of the country where it was being built. A copper mine that was going to produce was, at the time, the largest undeveloped copper mine in the world. And in global terms, the building of this copper mine was going to displace 80 or 90 herdsmen. Now, when you take a step back and you think about the needs of the world and you think about the impact on populations and climate and things, you think to yourself, 80, 90 people, that's not a big deal. And every report that he was being given spoke to the impacts of the mine on water, the impacts of the mine on the ecology, and even the impacts of the mine on these people. Only 2 of these herdsmen needed to actually be relocated. Apart from that, he was told everything would be fine. But I was on the ground and I knew the situation was different. I knew that it only took one herdsman with one camel to lie down in front of the gate of that mine, and there wasn't another drop of copper, there wasn't another ton of copper concentrate that was going to leave the mine. And so I kept warning him, I kept telling him, the situation is not good. You are not hearing what is going on. You don't understand the reality on the ground. And so he asked me what to do, and I said, give me a week. Give me a week, you and I, and bring your sleeping bag. And so he came a few weeks later, and the 2 of us drove. He came incognito. This is a man who usually travels with an entourage. And we traveled incognito for a week. And every night we drove to a different herdsman's encampment. We asked permission and we visited with them. And we slept the night under the stars outside the camp. And every day we drove on to another family and another house and we visited. And day after day, he heard stories. He heard about the challenge of moving animals around a mine site. He heard about the temptations of the mine to the kids of the next generation and how these herdsmen were terrified that their lineage would end, that there would be no next generation to take on the life and the traditions that they had carried for thousands of years. He heard about how the water table rose and dropped at different times of the year. He heard about the impact it had on the animals and on the ecology. And more than anything, he saw the tears in the eyes of these herdsmen and herdswomen when they spoke about what they were losing. Now, I don't want to tell you that suddenly everything changed. I'm going to tell you he went back and, everything. This is not a silver bullet. This was not a simple solution. But something in his heart was transformed. No one could ever present to him again without him knowing who was being talked about. And it was, at least for him and for the decisions that he made around that project, transformative to be close, to get proximate. Now, we have to be mindful that, as I say, this is no silver bullet, and that our own prejudices and perspectives can affect deeply what we see, and that kind of brief exposure is not the same as being truly a part of a society, of truly understanding those problems. And there remains a place for data and science and analysis and all of those other things. But it was something that he could do. It wasn't a series of things that other people should do. It was something that he could do, and he did. And so I want to offer that as something tangible, something practical that we could all do in our lives. We have to do it carefully. We have to do it wisely. But it's something that everybody here can do. And not just in the workplace, we can do it in our neighborhoods and in our communities. Because seeing knowledge for ourselves and seeing with our own eyes and not through the eyes of others can help us read other people's reality more clearly and act more justly. and it's perspective changing, and it's transformative. The second thing we can do is to change the narrative, to change how we think and speak about the world around us. And by doing that, we can change the narratives that shape and limit the opportunities for others around us as well. Now, this is not just about changing the language we use. It's not about semantics. It's not also some sort of wishful hope that we can talk our way out of these problems that we face. They require much more than that. They require systemic change. They require investment. They require tangible changes. But we know that the mental models and the paradigms that we use to understand the world around us can limit our thinking or liberate our imagination. And they can have a huge effect on those who are the most downtrodden. I've seen how this can be shaped by business in fantastic ways. Let me tell you one example of this. The stigma associated with having HIV/AIDS. Quite apart from the reality of the disease, its transmission, its health effects, its treatment, the stigma that people living with HIV experienced and still experience in many parts of the world, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, can be devastating. Some years ago, I was working for a foundation that had a long history of more than 30 years of working in South Africa addressing this issue. Working with communities living with HIV/AIDS to advance their rights. It worked with community, civil society groups to raise up their voice. It worked with advocates and legislators to change the regulatory environment. It had worked for years, but the toxic narratives and the practical hurdles persisted. So in South Africa then, if you had HIV/AIDS, it was impossible to get life insurance, just to give one example. So if you couldn't get life insurance, you couldn't get a mortgage. If you couldn't get a mortgage, you couldn't buy a house. And if you couldn't buy a house, then it was really hard to start a family. It was hard to enjoy one of the most basic human rights that all of us should be entitled to. And so despite the work on making insurance products legally available, they remained too expensive and impractical for people to access. One company set out to solve that. It's a company called All Life Insurance. And they set themselves up to provide life insurance policies for people with HIV/AIDS. And they did it by making the policies both cheaper and more accessible. It turns out that I found this out when I was visiting with them when we were looking at this investment. Turns out that none of us like thinking about when we're going to die. Who knew? And it turns out that if you're on the phone to buy life insurance, and you don't get it within about 20 minutes, the chances that you're going to buy it are going to drop off dramatically. Because after about that time, if it gets more complicated, none of us like thinking about it much longer, and so we sort of give up. And so if you called one of the questions about pre-existing conditions, yes, do you have HIV/AIDS? Yes. Well, let me put you through to another department and let's fill out some forms and let's get back to you in a few days. And it got very difficult. And not only difficult, it got impossibly expensive. Insurance companies just simply weren't interested in serving that sector of the market. They saw them as a problem. They saw them as victims. They had pity. But the narrative was that that was a problem. These people were a problem. Now, they solved this in a fantastic way. First of all, their product was designed to be sold to people with HIV/AIDS. You got on the phone, yes, you have AIDS, yes, let's keep going. Secondly, they discovered that if a person living with HIV/AIDS would attend a clinic and take an antiretroviral once a year, then the life expectancy, according to the actuarial tables, was almost that of a normal life. And so they could price that insurance policy in two ways. If you showed proof of attendance at a clinic, the policy was this price, and if you didn't, the price increased. Now, this was hugely successful. They were suddenly speaking to a sector of society that had been treated as other, had been disregarded and ignored, and they were meeting them where they were with a product that they needed. And this had three effects. First of all, tens of thousands of people got life insurance policies. Secondly, of course, this had a behavioral nudge which increased and improved the life expectancy outcomes for those people. But thirdly, what it did was it changed the narrative about people in the financial community about this community of people living with HIV/AIDS. Suddenly, the market saw them as customers, not victims, as a market to be served, as customers to be understood, and whose needs needed to be met. And so for me, it was a good example of how a shift in perspective can change the narrative about a group of people, and can increase and open up opportunity. The third thing I think that we all have to be prepared to do if we want to see change is we have to be prepared to do difficult things. Change will not come easily. Given the scale of the problems in the world, nothing is going to happen until we're prepared to get uncomfortable ourselves. It's really easy to think we can bring about change without giving anything up. The whole narrative of the impact movement, of which I've been a part, is that the double bottom line means we can literally have our cake and eat it. We can do it all. We can do it both. We don't have to really give anything up. But that's kind of magical thinking. Making change is difficult, and there are really difficult trade-offs that are required. And it needs people who are prepared to do really difficult, uncomfortable things. I want to tell you about a little village in Spain I visited. I visited a village in Spain and I met with a company, and they told me about how they had started. They said many years ago a priest arrived on a bicycle. He wanted to understand the situation in the village. He wanted to get proximate, you could say. And so he rode his bicycle around, and he got to meet people in the village, and he understood what the difficulties they were, and the causes and the drivers of the sort of economic impoverishment that he saw in the area. And he realized that one of the real barriers was education, was training. And so he set up a small education facility, and he trained some of the young men in new skills. And after a while, there were 5 young men, and they saw an opportunity to start a little company making kerosene heaters. And so he accompanied them in this process, and they talked about what mattered to them. And if they were going to set up a company, they wanted to do it differently. They didn't want to do a company like all the others. They wanted to do something that was going to transform not just their lives and their opportunities, but somehow could be transformative to their community. And so they established some principles for the company. Really, you could say some spiritual principles at the heart of this enterprise. They decided they would give up the privilege that would come from being the founders and owners of the company, and instead they would make every member of staff for all time an equal owner of the business. An equal owner, not just a little token share later on when you join in, but an equal owner. Everybody would be equal. They sacrificed the power that would come from being the leaders of the company, and instead decided to make decisions through consultation. Literally, one person, one vote. Even to the point of deciding and voting on who would be the CEO in the company. They decided that they would limit the vast inequalities between top and bottom in the company, and that the pay differential would never exceed, initially 3, ultimately 6 times. They said they would never allow the pay differential between the lowest and the highest in the company to be 6 times. You know, the CEO of Amazon right now in the US receives 6,000 times what the lowest worker earns. Their aspiration was, we want to limit it to 6. More than this, they decided upfront that they would use solidarity and social justice as the principles on which they would use the wealth that they accumulated as a company. Instead of share buybacks and dividends, they'd use the money to ensure that they never had to make anyone redundant, that they would find new opportunities, that they would adapt and grow the business. And more than anything, they decided to put learning and training at the center of what they did. Now, you might say this is not a sensible way of setting up a business if you want to be successful. And maybe there's a better way and an easier way of doing it. And then maybe once you've generated the wealth, you could sort of give it away. You could make it and then give it away. You could make it more efficiently, be more effective in doing all of that generation of the wealth, and then be thoughtful about how you give it away. But they decided to build this on these principles, and it was not easy. I think you can tell from the way I'm telling a story that the company is around. But they managed to survive without sacrificing any of those principles, without giving up any equity to anyone not a worker, without violating the 6-time wage gap, without making mass redundancies when they inevitably had divisions that went out of sale. And they built a company called Mondragon in the Basque region of Spain. Today, Mondragon is a cooperative of cooperatives, a conglomerate with 80,000 employees and 14 billion euros in revenues. It's among the largest corporations in Spain. It has businesses in finance, retail, manufacturing, technology, education, R&D, and it continues to do those difficult things. And I had to go there to see it myself because, frankly, I didn't believe it. I didn't believe it was possible to have a company where people voted on these kinds of decisions. And I met the CEO, and I talked with them, and I saw the proof. And it's extraordinary, and it's really difficult. And I tell this story because at the heart of what it takes to make change in the world, and what each of us needs to do at an individual, not just at a company level, is to do difficult things and take risk. Not the kind of, I'll take this risk if you price it out and give me the... Because that's not taking risk. Doing something because it's right. The real risk is making commitments to principle, people, places that may not work out, doing difficult and complex things that require sacrifice. The fourth and final thing, and then I'll close, that I think that we can all do to translate these ideas into reality is to choose to be hopeful. I started out by being honest about quite how hard I find it to be hopeful in these days. But I am persuaded that hope is a conscious choice that we can make, and not just a state of mind we find ourselves in. It's also a choice we must make if we want to build a better world. It's not irrational optimism. It's not choosing to invest in something that looks like a winner. Hope is, in the words of the Nobel laureate Václav Havel, an ability to work for something because it is good, not just because it stands a chance to succeed. I think the most hopeful investment I ever was a part of was an investment in a women's-based group lending microfinance scheme for groups of women in Sierra Leone and Liberia in the middle of the Ebola crisis. It could not get any more hopeless. It was the definition of hopeless. We were told we would lose our reputation, and of course we would lose our money if we made the investment. But my boss at the time was determined that we would. He was determined because it was led by one of the most hopeful, hope-filled individuals I have ever had the privilege to meet. If I asked you what was the largest NGO in the world, you would probably say Oxfam, you would say IRC, you would say the Red Cross. The largest NGO in the world is called BRAC. It's from Bangladesh. It employs 80,000 people. 126 million people around the world benefit in its services. It was founded by a man called Fazal Abed. He has at the core of his philosophy and his approach the belief that the barrier to poverty is not money, but hope. He said poverty is not just poverty of money or income. And I want to make an important correction to what I said. He doesn't say that the barrier to poverty is not money. That's really easy to stand in a Asilomar and say. He said poverty is not just poverty of money or income. We also see a poverty of self-esteem and hope. People trapped in a cycle of destitution don't realize their lives can be changed for the better through their own activities. Once they understand it, it's like a light gets turned on. And BRAC does this in an incredibly detailed and sophisticated way. They graduate people from poverty through a mix of financial support, education, training, healthcare, community mobilization. And it's centered around nurturing hope amongst people that have no hope. And to sit with those women in Sierra Leone, to hear the stories, to learn from their insight, to admire their determination, to see the power of them realizing that they were taking ownership, and that they were protagonists of their own growth and development, was a lesson that continues to give me hope to this day. So these are the 4 things I want to suggest that we can all do to build spiritual capital and contribute to change. Get proximate, change the narrative, do difficult things, choose hope. And I recognize this might seem to be somewhat at odds with the model of capitalism that prevails in the world. Capitalism exists in what we think of as the real world. This sounds like an ideal world, because capitalism views the worth of an individual chiefly in terms of how much one can accumulate and how many goods one can consume relative to others. But capitalism has a fatal flaw. It itself is at odds with how the real world really works. When we look at nature, we see this. We see that life rewards cooperation. Life builds from the bottom up. Life banks on diversity. Life recycles everything. Life builds resilience through diversity, decentralization, and redundancy. Life optimizes rather than maximizes. Life selects for the good of the whole system. In short, life creates the conditions conducive to life. And so in a very real sense, we are all part of an organic whole. The way in which we approach our economic lives and our commercial decisions must reflect the reality that everything we do is linked and intertwined. And as the quote we opened with says so well, the welfare of any segment of humanity is inextricably bound up with the welfare of the whole. Thank you.
Think of sharing what you know.